ultimately failed, while the Chinese Communist Party has proved, certainly since 1978, to be a model of flexibility and pragmatism. It is not easy to make the transition to modernity. Few nations have succeeded, and China, because of its immense size and diversity, not to mention its history, is one of the most difficult challenges of all. I would make 4 suggestions in this context. Firstly, there is an immense difference between the Chinese and Soviet communist traditions, which has been obscured and blurred by the homogenizing connotation of the word communist. Secondly, the Chinese Communist Party is in effect in the process of becoming a ruling party whose legitimacy depends on its ability to govern successfully. This is very different from the traditional raison d'etre of a communist party. In fact, it conforms to the rationale of a governing party in the developmental state, as in the ancient times. Now, I say this with a note of caution. The concept of the developmental state, in my view, fails adequately to describe the nature of the legitimacy of government in Northeast Asia. That legitimacy still is primarily embedded in the culture, not merely the economic record of a government. Thirdly, the Communist Party is widely criticized for the absence of democracy in China. This is hypocrisy. No Western country was democratic during the process of industrialization. In fact, the only country I can think of that certainly qualifies is India. The fact is that democracy has not historically proved to be a favorable environment for delivering the necessary conditions for economic takeoff. Fourthly, if one wants to understand the specificities of China, then the history and culture of China is far away more important than the fact that it has a communist regime. Indeed, rather laying stress on the communist regime as such, in some ways it is more revealing to see the latter as simply the latest in a long line of dynasties. Be that as it may, the history of the 20th century has meant that the word communist is drenched in political meaning. The question is over-politicized, and that situation will certainly continue. The communist regime will be a stick with which the United States in particular will beat China whenever it chooses. There's not much that China can do about that. And the future? First, it is in both China's interests and the world's that the present regime continues for as long as possible, at least while it is so clearly successful and competent. Serious political instability will do grave damage to China, and indeed the world. Imagine, if you will, the consequences of China suffering the same kind of meltdown as the Soviet Union. It would be a national and global disaster of far greater consequence than what happened to the Soviet Union. In reality, of course, this will not happen. Second, as China becomes increasingly developed, pressures will grow for democratization. But my guess is that these still lie, at least in any fundamental form, a long way in the future. The fact is that the great bulk of China remains, and will remain for a long time to come, poor and underdeveloped. That will constrain the pressure for democratic reform. Thirdly, ultimately, there will indeed be a profound shift in the nature of political governance in China. But when and to what is impossible to predict. There are many possibilities. If the country gets into grave difficulties, there could be a serious regression, perhaps profound instability, or a dose of heavy authoritarianism, or both. But assuming China's development continues successfully, there could be one-party rule in the context of a multi-party system, a little like Japan, which people refer to as a democracy, but it doesn't look vaguely like a Western democracy. Or even a multi-party system with no continuing Communist Party dominance. One thing, though, which whatever happens, is for certain. Whichever outcome or outcomes prevail, all will bear the characteristics of Chinese history and culture. Chinese democracy will be very different from a Western-style democracy. Which brings me to my fifth theme. A bit of water. Quick pit stop. My fifth theme is East Asia as the new global epicenter. Different regions of the world enjoy different significance in different periods. For 150 years, from 1800 to 1950, Europe was undoubtedly the most important region in the world. And even after 1945, when it wasn't, Europe's decline, and when Europe's decline became palpable with the collapse of European empires, Europe's position was still, in a sense, pivotal, because the fault line of the Cold War bisected it. But since the end of the Cold War, it has become abundantly clear that Europe, for economic, military, cultural, and geopolitical reasons, no longer occupies that position. A combination of East Asia's extraordinary economic growth and the fact that it is home to around 1/3 of the world's population means that the global centre of gravity is moving remorselessly in its direction. The tipping event in this context is the rise of China, which is not only rapidly emerging as the new fulcrum of the East Asian economy, but has also helped to transform the size of the latter, such that it now easily surpasses, in terms of regional GDP, both Europe and North America. East Asia is the biggest economic region in the world, by quite a way. The new centrality of East Asia is not just, though, an economic question, even though it is the economic metamorphosis of the region that has revolutionized its global significance. The East Asian theatre will be where many of the most important global conflicts and tensions will be played out over the next few decades. One of the great advantages that the United States enjoyed in its emergence as a global power was that its own region, the Americas, provided little challenge or threat. The United States could at once be both the dominant regional power and a major global power. The same was not true, at least in the same way, in Europe, because it was laced for centuries with bitter interstate rivalry. But this was in a situation where, from 1800 onwards, Europe was by far the most dominant continent in the world, such that intra-European conflicts were projected directly onto the global stage, as in the case of colonial rivalry and the two world wars. Britain, therefore, could be the major European power and the major global power. East Asia offers a very different scenario. It will be extremely difficult for China to emerge as a hegemonic regional power because of Japan's geographical proximity and the United States' presence as a global hegemon within the region. There is also, of course, in the neighbouring region, South Asia, the very important question of how India will choose to align itself. We will witness over the next few decades, metaphorically speaking, much moving of the geopolitical furniture within East Asia. It will be in East Asia that the first stage of a new rivalry between China and the United States is fought out, as the former begins to challenge the latter's dominant security role in the region. This process is already underway. It is clear that over the last 5 years or so, China has quietly made serious progress in its relations with both Southeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula at the expense of the United States, not least because the latter's attention has been largely focused on the Middle East. But this is only the very beginning of what will be an extremely protracted and very fraught process, with many unexpected twists and turns in store. Much will depend on how China portrays and projects itself in the region. Its policy of rapprochement with ASEAN, South Korea and India have so far been very effective. In contrast, however, relations between China and Japan are clearly following a very different course. Japan, the powerhouse of East Asia since the Meiji Restoration in 1868, gives every appearance of being frozen in history, unable to rethink its relationship with its Asian hinterland, which both the legacy of Japanese colonialism and the economic transformation of East Asia now require. It seems to be in a state of denial in regard to the rise of China. It appears less able to confront and adjust to this new reality than any other country in the region, if not the world. The post-Meiji mindset that Japan belongs more to the West than Asia will, in these very new historical circumstances, at least in the long run, serve the country ill. Its inability to forge a new relationship with its neighbours and its fear of the rise of China is likely to, and is already, pushing it ever closer to the United States. This is a process that the United States is already encouraging and is likely to encourage even more in the future as a means of containing China.